Good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Glad to be here on our first Manuscript Monday of February, February 9th. We're here with Josh Levy from the Library of Congress, but let me introduce a little bit about the Manuscript Society. It was founded in 1948 as the National Society of Autograph Collectors, and it includes not just collectors now, but also manuscript curators, librarians, dealers, and auction houses. The first members were from the United States and Canada, but now has members from around the world, including Asia, Australia, Europe, and South America. The mission of the Manuscript Society is to encourage the collection and preservation of manuscripts and documents, to stimulate and aid collectors in their various collecting specialties, and to facilitate the exchange of information and knowledge among scholars, collectors, dealers, and the general public. In addition to Manuscript Mondays, the Manuscript Society publishes a quarterly journal, Manuscripts, and a quarterly newsletter, the Manuscript Society News. The Society also has a scholarship program, the Richard Moss Research Grant, and the deadline is February 14th. So if you know of anybody in a graduate student who is interested in using manuscripts for their research, please reach out and look at the on the website. And finally, the Society holds an annual meeting, which offers members a fun-filled get-together and behind-the-scenes visits to memorable historic sites, manuscript repositories, and museums, both in the United States and abroad. And this year's annual meeting is going to be held in Boston from May 27th to the 31st. And if you're a member of the Manuscript Society, there's information that has recently been sent out. We're very pleased to welcome Josh Levy from the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress, where he serves as the historian of science and technology. He oversees collections that include the papers of Samuel Morse, Matthew Fontaine Maury, Alexander Graham Bell, the Wright brothers, Sigmund and Anna Freud, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Carl Sagan, Dr. Ruth Westheimer, and Gladys West. He has published on a range of topics, including agricultural history and the history of nutrition, to Native and Pacific history and the history of mathematics. He has taught history and indigenous studies courses at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the University of South Florida, and the College of Micronesia. He holds a PhD in modern U.S. history from the University of Illinois and a Master of Theological Studies degree from Harvard Divinity School. And tonight, he'll be telling us about some of the manuscripts held in the Library of Congress. So thank you very much, Josh, for being here, and take it away.
Thanks, Dave, for having me. How does my screen share look? Can you see the full slide and the full screen?
Looks great, Josh.
Looks good.
Thanks.
We see it.
Fantastic. Excellent. Well, yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. As Jay mentioned, I work in the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress. I curate about 900 manuscript collections there across a wide range of scientific subfields. And so what I'd like to do is give kind of a big overview of the history of our science and technology manuscript collecting at the library, but to focus that overview on how evolving ideas about professional eminence and prestige have shaped our collecting, and how we've worked to fill some of the gaps left behind by that approach. And then halfway through the presentation, I'll dwell a little bit on a major conference that took place in Washington in 1960, where library professionals wrestled with some of the same questions that we wrestle with now, the Conference on Science Manuscripts. Let me get my next slide here. Oops. All right. Ooh. Sorry. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So let's start at the beginning. One of our very first science or technology manuscript collections at the library was the papers of a steamboat inventor named John Fitch. The Fitch papers were acquired in 1867. They were part of a large group of collections that were acquired by a manuscript by a printer and politician named Peter Force. This is still really early in the library's history. There was not even a standalone building for the library. We were still inside the Capitol building. But Force's goal, which was to illustrate the history of America and demonstrate its eminence in the world, it was a pretty good foreshadowing of the later collecting goals that the library would have for its manuscripts, including its science and technology manuscripts. And Fitch's collection within the Force papers does reveal some of the tensions that are inherent to any collecting project that uses professional prestige or eminence as a proxy for historical significance. Because those are powerful categories, but they're also surprisingly unstable. Ben Bascom, the literature scholar, has called Fitch a spectacular failure in his life. Fitch had a claim to the invention of the steamboat, but he was also a man who lost his business and his patents and his financial backing and his closest friends, along with his most deeply held desire, which was to be widely recognized as a man of consequence. In his lifetime, you could describe Fitch as a kind of sweaty self-promoter, and this was in the kind of early Republican period where that was really looked down upon. This is the time when people would say, General Washington, you should be president, and he would say, me? You ask me? Fitch didn't fit in, and that cast him far outside the privileged circles within which people like Ben Franklin circulated. But a few decades after Fitch's death, the tables turned. Now he had been so ignored and so rejected that he was ripe for resuscitation by anti-government Jacksonians who reimagined him as a victim of federalism. So no longer this kind of aspirant to a Benjamin Franklin-ish position, he became a kind of icon of the slighted genius of the common man. And that's how he ended up in the Peter Force papers, and that's how he ended up in the library and what library staff started to call the National Manuscript Collections. It's a little bit old-fashioned now, maybe, to have an explicit institutional goal to collect for eminence or prestige. Many institutions have tried to broaden their acquisitions in order to document the stories of actors, communities, labor, activism that might have been overlooked by earlier generations of history professionals. And in many ways, the library has tried to do that also. But even so, science and technology collecting poses some unique challenges. Here you see some excerpts from an article published in 1968 by one of my predecessors at the library, the historian Nathan Reingold. And here Reingold is recalling his astonishment in one of his other positions at the National Archives at colleagues who he said were so intimidated by what they assumed to be the overwhelmingly specialized nature of science and technology manuscripts that either they avoided the materials altogether or they expected him to do what he calls erecting an archival mystique of scientific records. One of the problems with collecting in the history of science is that science sounds really hard and it sounds really smart. And a lot of the people that work in libraries and archives have humanities backgrounds rather than science backgrounds. So people get intimidated. And some of that intimidation stems from a specific historical moment, the moment of the so-called big science project around the time of the Second World War, projects that are huge and collaborative and government funded, like the Manhattan Project. And that was a time when scientists seemed to be gaining this world-shaking power by mastering knowledge that was so specialized that it was just impenetrable to everybody else. And some of those ideas have lingered. And they've lingered so much that archives professionals, even now, might find themselves reverting back to categories of eminence as defined by scientists themselves, and then inadvertently reproducing scientific hierarchies in the collecting that they do. And that's a problem because it means we're not documenting scientific work as holistically as we should. And because scientists themselves actually are not the primary users of science and technology manuscript collections in almost any institution. So a lot goes into the shaping of a scientific hierarchy that archivists and librarians need to pay attention to. There's individual self-fashioning, professional rivalries, political currents, regional cultures, the shifting fortunes of professional fields. And those things can influence repositories even when they don't explicitly use categories like prestige or national significance or eminence to shape their collecting the way that the Library of Congress does. So let's talk about one of our collections, the papers of Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph. Morse was more successful than Fitch, but if anything, he was more anxious, more extreme in his self-promotion, more obsessed with installing himself as one of the nation's greatest men. Morse's father was an influential geographer and pastor, known as the father of American geography. Morse was a portrait painter. maybe the second or third most celebrated in the country. And when he was younger, he kind of flitted through Europe, going to museums, copying the works of the great masters. And then he returned home to paint Americans ranging from the white elites of Charleston, South Carolina, up to President James Monroe. And in this image, you can see his portrait of Monroe, which is beautiful. It was one of Monroe's favorites, and it still hangs in the White House to this day. The artistic career that Morse pursued for the first half of his life, it brought him a keen sense for marketing, and it brought him a network of powerful connections, but also an angry, kind of intense conviction that his talents were going unappreciated and that he was being underpaid. It's not uncommon for artists, I think. So by the 1840s, now having created a telegraph out of an artist's canvas stretcher, Morse was in Washington, haunting the halls of power, seeking financing for a telegraph line to Baltimore that he could use to vindicate his brilliance and show up his European rivals because he didn't have the only telegraph in the market at the time, and fill his pockets. And in the process, he started to rhetorically link the fate of his telegraph with the fate of the nation. And this was Morse's attempt to fashion himself into a man of scientific eminence, more successful than Fitch's. And like Fitch, it helped bring his papers to us at the library. Morse's papers came to the library through donation in 1916, about 2 decades after we founded a standalone manuscript division, which happened in 1897. And by that time, we had developed kind of broad collections development program that was really built around what you could call political Americana, and that's still a major strength. Currently, the manuscript division has over 12,000 individual collections, and among them are the papers of 23 U.S. presidents, everyone from Washington to Coolidge, with pretty substantial collections of quite a few of them. We have the papers of dozens of Supreme Court and federal judges, and major strengths in areas like women's suffrage and the civil rights movement. We have the papers of the NAACP and the National Urban League, for example, and substantial holdings in military and diplomatic history, literature and the arts, and of course in science and technology. So in 1916, did library staff debate whether Morse was nationally significant or eminent enough for his papers to belong here? We have administrative case files. There's no evidence that they did. But even if somebody had objected and said that an inventor is not suitable for the library's collections, Morse was definitely political. He lobbied on behalf of his own invention, but he also served as the chief spokesman for the Native American Party, followed by decades of advocacy against Catholicism and foreign immigration and abolitionism. And he actually made two unsuccessful runs for the mayorship of New York on a nativist ticket. And actually, as historian Jakob Vektas writes, Morse's scientific self-promotion was really grounded in his politicization of his invention. So the invention itself was also political, making his personal success, Morse argued, a matter of national prestige. So for one thing, Morse and his allies really worked hard to write him into the national story of the United States domestically. One of his allies, a congressman from New York named Charles Ferris, in 1842 told a House committee, quote, "It is a matter of national pride that the invention of the first electromagnetic telegraph by Professor Morse, as well as the first conception of using electricity as a means of transmitting intelligence by Dr. Franklin, is the offspring of American genius." But Morse's struggle for legitimacy and financial gain, it wasn't just something that happened in the United States. It took him and employees and allies of his to the palaces and royal retreats of Europe and to East Asia and to the Middle East. And in all of those places, Morse sought one of the era's key markers of scientific prestige. You saw it on the previous slide. He would get these medals from foreign leaders and use that to provide evidence that his invention was effective and prestigious and worthy of further celebration. And often he got those medals, some of which were diamond studded and really gorgeous, following dazzling in-person displays of his invention in operation. And here you see on the screen a diploma that Morse received from the Ottoman Empire. This accompanied a kind of gorgeous diamond-filled medal that he received at the same time. And in the collection, actually, this is it's pasted into a book because it's one of our earlier collections, and that's the way manuscripts were preserved in the late 19th, early 20th century at the library. And on the next page, there is the kind of ceremonial bag with a tassel that this diploma came in. Bectus says that when he worked to secure commendations like this one and others from European leaders, Morse was, quote, fighting the American battle for international recognition of his country's science and technology. Or in other words, Morse was positioning himself as a national hero as he sought to promote his telegraph, but also as a kind of nationalist hero. So I think it's fair to say, no matter how you slice it, that Morse was a significant figure in a couple of different registers. But the library didn't really have a program to collect the papers of scientists in 1916. So did library staff even care whether Morse was a real scientist? Maybe not, since it wasn't really a question that they were asking. But either way, the figure of the scientific investigator had really evolved a lot since Morse's time, from the 1840s through the 1910s. In that period, there had been dramatic intellectual and social changes within the sciences in the United States. There had been a cultural shift from a really widespread, deep celebration of scientific amateurs and amateurism to a flowering of new professional disciplines, institutions, professional journals, funding opportunities, really to a kind of early version of what we would recognize as a professional science ecosystem today. The historian Catherine McNure has written that the process of scientific professionalization in the United States was muddy and uneven. And it wasn't something that happened all at once. It wasn't just the 1870s, although that was kind of a pivotal moment in which a lot of changes happened quickly. For McNure, this is something that started from the antebellum era and then ran through maybe the early 20th century. And disciplines were formalizing, and as they did, in her words, they defined their community rules and training, they determined whom to exclude, and they began to author their own historical narratives. A lot of people were excluded from the professional sciences as this happened. Among them were women and people of color, but also scientific amateurs of any background. And Morse was an amateur. He was trained in the arts, not the sciences. He operated a business, not a research laboratory. He had no professorship, at least not one that was primarily focused around scientific knowledge. He did have a position teaching at what became NYU, but he was teaching art and photography. And Morse was someone who applied the theoretical work of his contemporaries rather than developing his own theories and then publishing them. And so, in this new world of professional scientific fields, somebody like Morse became increasingly less likely to meet the standards of this new class of scientific gatekeepers. For us at the library, this was a national story and it was a local story. Nationally, there was this crop of new gatekeepers, like physicist Henry Rowland, and you see him pictured there. He was a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins. Rowland was speaking up in defense of what people started to call pure science, and he demanded that it be fostered through institutional reform. This is his 1883 address to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and there he seems to define pure science as theoretical research that's pursued without regard for financial gain. Rowland was demanding a science that had integrity, and he wanted to achieve it through professional exclusivity. In this speech, which is a kind of a classic of this genre, Rowland claims that he has no disdain for applied sciences like Morse's telegraphy, but the analogies that he chooses in this speech tell a pretty clear story. So for Rowland, an applied scientist is like a household cook, but a pure scientist is a chemist. And a telegrapher, like someone working in a telegraph office, is a sort of narrow-minded provincial drudge. But the electromagnetic theorist is someone that cultivates a broad-ranging global vision. He especially is sort of flowery as he describes the kind of local celebrity naturalist. He refers to this naturalist character as someone who was sort of backslapped for naming some crab with an extra claw, which he found in his morning ramble. But for Rowland, somebody like that could never match up against a physicist of the first class. And remember, he is a physicist, but he still insists that there are no physicists of the first class in the United States because the institutions can't support cultivating one. That's the national story. The local story is about Washington coming into its own as a scientific city. we have strong connections between scientific institutions and federal sort of science-centered agencies and universities now. But in the antebellum period, some of that was quite new. The postbellum federal government's engagement into science, it was expanding rapidly. And that expansion drew hundreds of specialists and bureaucrats to the city. And they started to network with one another, and they planted scientific clubs and societies across Washington. And some of Rowland's most prominent scientific contemporaries were themselves creatures of Washington. They were people like Nautical Almanac Office Director Simon Newcomb, who you see there looking quite young on the right, and U.S. Coast Survey Superintendent Alexander Dallas Bakke on the left. We acquired their papers in 1909 and 1914. Bakke was especially important. He had a kind of scientific genealogy. He was a relative of Ben Franklin's, but he was also the leader of an influential scientific clique that called itself the Lazzaroni. Lazzaroni means a beggar, and they chose the name because they described themselves as scientific beggars for the kind of purity of their scientific work. And they worked especially hard to bring the American sciences, as they saw it, in line with European standards. Bakke had a nemesis, and that nemesis was the subject of last month's Manuscript Society talk. It was the oceanographer Matthew Fontaine Maury. Maury was the exact kind of person that the Lazzaroni hoped to be able to drum out of scientific circles, and especially out of the most elite scientific spaces in Washington and beyond. Maury was a brilliant man, but he was largely a self-trained naval officer, not a professor. Maury's work was more practical than theoretical, although I think you could argue that he does some of both. He was aiming to do things that would help the Navy and to help navigators function more effectively in the world. He wanted to improve navigational maps. He wanted to improve weather forecasting, facilitate telegraphic communications, a lot of other things. He was a really ambitious guy. Bakke didn't like the fact that Maury had a limited formal education. That might have been his biggest complaint. But he also felt that Maury's kind of boundless, unrestrained ambition and the wide range of his interest suggested not a person that was hardworking and curious and helpful to a lot of different fields, but somebody who had a sort of absence of essential moral qualities that you needed to have to do a real science, like moderation, sobriety, patience, self-control. So Bakke, although he had been friendly with Maury when they were both younger, really had it out for him in the city. But even so, library staff seem to have not been convinced by that because we did acquire Maury's papers in 1912. In fact, that donation was especially dramatic because it was a donation that came after a formal presentation of Maury's papers by his daughters in the Oval Office. They offered them to President Taft. In fact, the papers to Taft and then medals that Maury had won to the Smithsonian. So they came in that way, and that was part of an effort on our part to build the papers of significant Americans that function within Washington political spaces. But for the daughters, for the family, it was also an effort to start rehabilitating Maury's reputation after he had defected to the Confederacy during the Civil War, and then done a bunch of things afterwards, like asked the Emperor of Mexico to invade California, things like that, as one does. It's a significant donation in part because it helps establish a growing trend for us, and that is our documentation of the history of science and technology as it can be read through the lens of Washington, D.C. and the federal government institutions here. And for the next maybe 5 decades, our definition of scientific eminence intersected a lot less with the standards of somebody like Bakke and the Lazzaroni, and much more with an enthusiasm for political Americana that embraced both practical and theoretical scientists, especially when those scientists had a high profile and sustained engagement with federal scientific institutions and with the military. So here's just a list of some of our major science and technology acquisitions during those first few decades of the 20th century. And you can see clusters of military and civil engineers here. There's military officers and people that were sort of semi-scientific explorers. There's chemists with the USDA. There's naturalists with the US Biological Survey. And then the part-time Washingtonian and inventor of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell. And also at the same time, we started to build clusters of collections in the history of aeronautics and psychoanalysis, including the papers of the Wright brothers and Sigmund Freud. But those came to us through kind of separate arrangements. Those weren't collections that the manuscript division necessarily pursued, of its own accord. And that brings us to that major gathering of library and archives professionals that I mentioned at the beginning, the Conference of Science Manuscripts that took place in 1960. It was a fascinating conference, I think really interesting to go back to, especially for somebody in my position. The Conference on Science Manuscripts had representatives from science and technology collecting institutions. There were historians there, a few scientists, and they all took the opportunity to confront a relationship between science and the state that had been dramatically altered by the Second World War, and to rethink the way that the history of science was being preserved in the United States. And they worried about how to serve a growing community of scholars who seemed eager to reevaluate the country's scientific and technological history. Nathan Reingold, who I mentioned earlier as one of my predecessors at the library, was the chair. At the time, he was on staff at the library's Science and Technology Division. You see him on the top left there. And Luther Evans was there also. He had been the Librarian of Congress, but by that time he was serving as Director General of UNESCO. And both of their comments at the conference shed some really interesting light on the library's evolving appraisal of what sort of scientist or inventor belonged in the national manuscript collections. And they were looking forward and they were looking backward. So looking forward, there now was this widespread sense that radar and the atomic bomb had helped win the Second World War. And there was an increased interest in physics and chemistry. There was a moment in which physicists were kind of national heroes in a way that they never had been before. And that echoed the way that the use of military aircraft during World War I had helped spark interest in documenting the history of aeronautics at the time. In both cases, it was because there was this sense among political historians that science is political. We're already interested in military history and political history. Now we realize how deeply science can impact both of those older fields. And at the same time, historians of science were multiplying during the 1950s and the 1960s, even if the balance of that field was still Europeanists, including Europeanists in the United States, who were researching the scientific revolution in a much earlier period of scientific history. Still, the field was growing. But even so, the conference seemed confident that researcher interest would come, and for the library, it was especially clear that scientific work had a political edge, and that resonated with what the division was already doing. We were already trying to read the significance of scientific work through the lens of Washington. That's looking forward. Looking backward, there were historians, among them Nathan Reingold, who were starting to reassess the scientific figures of earlier generations. And this goes back to Maury again, actually. So a few years after the conference, Reingold wrote about Maury. You see an excerpt here from one of his essays. The historian Helen Roswadowski has suggested that Reingold was one of a group of historians who judged Maury's science, quote, bad or wrong, pushed out by new paradigms created by trained professional scientists. In other words, Reingold was repurposing the Lazzaroni's critiques for a new age. Here he's accusing Maury of allowing the U.S. Naval Observatory's astronomical research to languish and openly placing, quote, the interests of his military service ahead of the advancements of science, which he calls a cardinal scientific sin. Reingold also reiterated here some accusations of his 19th century enemies, that Maury was an outsider and a rival and a fake. Evans was around the conference as well. As Librarian of Congress. He had a much more kind of bird's eye view of the science and technology manuscript acquisitions that the institution had made. But he looked in the rear view in a kind of general broad way and asserted that the institution had, as he put it, lacked a systematic program in collecting the manuscripts of scientists. And then he also offered the pithy observation that manuscript solicitations in the past had tended to target the big fish, which is certainly true. These are some of the papers that were presented at the conference. There's quite a few more, but you get a sense here of some of the variety of topics that were involved in these conversations. There were questions about how to more comprehensively document histories of science and technology. Some of the questions that arose that are still relevant for us now. Could an individual's papers ever sufficiently document the collaborative nature of scientific work? Should manuscript collections be supplemented by a scientist's raw data? And if so, what kind of data and how much of it is okay to take? Do repositories that collect in the history of science also need to create oral history programs? And they also worried about just information that was being lost. In their case, they were especially concerned about the telephone, that people were calling each other and talking on the telephone rather than writing letters. We have, of course, versions of that same kind of technological anxiety about manuscripts now. But maybe the most significant question that came up at the conference was how the scientific big fish was supposed to be defined. Whether exclusively acquiring the papers of the best known, the most eminent professionals should even be the goal of any collecting institution in the first place. Reingold had a sort of awkward take on that question, which was that if you limit acquisitions to what he called the Einsteins, it would create a dramatically unrepresentative set of collections, which is true. And it's, if you only collected Einstein-like figures, future historians would never be able to use your collections to reconstruct the broader scientific society of your era. But on the other hand, and this is the awkward part, Reingold thought it was a bad idea to build what he called a special program to designate somebody as second rate and then tell that person that we want to save his papers for that reason. Reingold, especially in later years, sometimes described himself as a social historian of science. He said he was someone who preferred the routine, the lowest common denominator, over great ideas, great scientists, and great revolutionary events. And in 1968, he wrote, "There's a real need for a view from the bottom, from the laboratory bench, as well as the director's office." So I think it was telling that at this conference in 1960, Reingold seemed unable to come up with language that sidestepped the logic of scientific eminence as a collecting prerequisite. And instead, he seems to dismiss those beneath the pinnacles of their disciplines as lesser lights. And actually, that was an oversight just about everybody at the conference seemed to make, to be fair to Reingold, I guess. Even though the meeting's setting offered some clear insight about who the era's scientific gatekeepers were keeping out of the room, literally out of the room. The Cosmos Club wouldn't admit an African American member until 1962, 2 years after the conference, and no women at all until 1988. Women had to come through a side door with a male escort until the 80s. That oversight was also suggestive, though, of how hegemonic, how complete the 19th century's reimagining of the scientific professional had been. Reingold couldn't think his way out of the framework. The historian René Berglund writes that if we define science in terms of tenured positions rather than laboratory work or writing or teaching, all of which are forms of scientific labor in which women and people of color have been more likely to participate, then it shouldn't come as a surprise when that labor is conceptualized as non-science and the people who perform it are labeled as non-scientists. Of course, our job as archives and libraries professionals is to ask whether that is true or not, and whether those stories are worth documenting. So in other words, there was a fracture at the heart of Reingold's project to document the whole of the Cold War's scientific society, and it was not going to be remedied by acquiring the papers of the country's second most eminent scientists. Here's some collections that we acquired around this time after this conference. The library actually didn't assign a historian to oversee the science and technology manuscript acquisitions full-time until 1995. I'm only the second person in that role, actually. So this list is still kind of the division collectively working on this together part-time, I guess. But the division's acquisitions did shift after 1960. We not only were documenting Washington's way of doing science, but we're also seeking out the papers of influential, often award-winning figures whose work just had a national reach. Collections also increasingly seem to be coming in clusters as library staff work to document collaborative, large-scale scientific initiatives. And you can see some of the figures that we acquired during that period. There's scientists and administrators at the U.S. Naval Observatory. There's people working with NASA, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. There's also a good cluster of collections on the Manhattan Project and the International Geophysical Year. And there's a couple of figures that are scientific but don't necessarily have a strong connection to the city of Washington. The psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, the botanist Luther Burbank, anthropologists Margaret Mead and Rhoda Matroh, the chemist Henry Aaron Hill, and ecologists Barry Commoner and E.O. Wilson. Over the past 3 decades, our science and technology manuscript acquisitions have broadened, and the interests of the researchers we serve have broadened also. They include researchers who may no longer agree with Henry Rowland's judgment that a telegrapher is a provincial drudge or the household cook is not a chemist. They include scholars of disciplines that, of course, did not exist in 1960, environmental historians, researchers in interdisciplinary fields like science and technology studies, women's and gender studies, ethnic studies, and public historians who are on the lookout for stories about lost scientific women, as they call them, or hidden figures. Finally, in 1992, we did develop an internal policy that partially formalized the library's longstanding use of eminence as a collecting category. It directed staff to seek out the papers of nationally eminent Americans or non-eminent individuals whose collections hold substantial research value. But that collection of eminence still remains really unstable and it's still evolving. And it still allows for library staff to ask, as they always could have asked, I guess, eminent to whom, right? Who is defining this eminence? And asking that question has helped the staff to build some new collection clusters, including science-adjacent activists whose positions outside the academy offer some alternative perspectives on scientific concerns. Here you see some of those major acquisitions from the more recent period, the papers of environmentalists and animal rights activists, environmental justice advocates, and academics who have served as advocates for women in the sciences. There's a little cluster of those folks. And those collections are great because they help shed light on what Reingold had called the scientific society of their era, the astronomer Vera Rubin, biochemist Maxine Singer, the biologist Rita Caldwell, who was the head of the NSF. And we've also expanded our longstanding collecting strength in African American history with the papers of psychiatrists like Alvin Poussin and William Greer, and hidden figure mathematician Gladys West, and a mathematician I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, Gloria Ford Gilmer. And at the same time, we do continue to do the work that we were doing before, pursuing the big fish, administrators of big federal scientific agencies like DARPA and the EPA, and big kind of nationally recognized ubiquitous figures like Carl Sagan and Dr. Ruth Westheimer and Dr. Anthony Fauci. And before I wrap up, I just want to highlight two of those recent acquisitions. The first one is the man you see up there on the top. It's the physicist Gordon Gould. Gould was a sort of outsider graduate student in physics at Columbia. In 1957, he sketched out a design for the world's first laser. Gould was untrained in patent law, and so he found himself in a decades-long legal battle with a much more eminent physicist and one that was much better resourced, Charles Townes, whose papers we acquired back in 1999. Townes had been the inventor of the maser. Townes had filled prestigious academic roles. He served on government advisory boards. He won awards ranging from the National Medal of Science to the Nobel Prize. Whereas Gould sort of went from job to job and had his career derailed by the demands of the patent litigation that he was engaged with. But in 2024, 25 years later, after Towns's papers came here, Gould's papers also found a home at the Library of Congress. And the two collections now complement each other. They both have a lot of description and documentation of the lawsuits, but the Gould collection has a rich, intimate document of a physicist's struggles to escape the margins of his field, which is fascinating. Something that you wouldn't necessarily find in the papers of somebody like Townes, who sort of only succeeded in his career. And the second collection I wanted to highlight is the papers of Gloria Ford Gilmer, who you see down there on the bottom left. Gilmer was a Milwaukee-based educator, and she was a pioneer of a field called ethnomathematics, which is a movement that seeks to understand the relationship between math and culture in a sort of broad sense. Gilmer first built her career as a math instructor. She worked in teaching roles in HBCUs up and down the East Coast, and then she moved into curriculum development. Her best known research project was one that encouraged classroom teachers to use African American hair braiding to teach students about geometry. But her collection, which is large, it's about 200 boxes, also documents the staggering scale of her professional networking, her tireless committee work for groups like the American Mathematical Society, and an intense commitment to her students. So, in other words, it's a career that flowed outward from the classroom. And it's one that entangled mathematical ideas with community level civil rights concerns in a way that we don't necessarily see in other science collections of ours. Uh, it, Earlier generations of history and archives professionals might have considered Gould to be a lesser light and Gilmer to be a sort of non-scientist educator. But I think it's fair to say that both are nationally significant figures whose papers document important stories that we can't find in other collections. And I also think that they both suggest lessons that could be useful for any repository that collects science and technology manuscripts. First, that there are significant collecting opportunities for archives that consider alternative forms of science and technology influence. Not only can a more expansive view of who matters in STEM fields build a more comprehensive document of scientific inquiry overall, and that's something that Reingold said that he wanted. He said he wanted to document the history of science from the laboratory bench as well as from the director's office. It also includes histories that extend beyond the laboratory's walls. As I mentioned, many archives find that non-scientists are the primary users of their science and technology collections anyway. Um, and second, that donor outreach should take the continuing influence of those prestige-based hierarchies into account, especially because scientists and inventors rarely find themselves in our archives. It may never occur to somebody who hasn't been excessively celebrated by the scientific establishment to put their papers in an archive in the first place. Or if they do think that they have an interesting collection, they might assume that repositories like ours are only interested in the papers of the Einsteins. And those papers can be shared by the scientists themselves, or they can be shared by family members who may think that, grandma was just an assistant, so her papers have no historical value. So just to close, and this is us in the Madison building here at the library. This is where the manuscript division is located. One of the questions that the conference on science manuscripts asked back in 1960 was how proactive collecting institutions need to be when they seek to document the history of science, whether opportunities weren't being missed when scientists assumed that everything of value in their work was already documented in their publications. And the answer to the question is the same now as it was then. Staff need to be very proactive. And it's not only because scientists usually don't think about archives, but because a holistic representative set of collections that broadly documents the scientific society of our time, it's not just going to walk through the door on its own. The easy way to do this is to read lists of Nobel Prize winners or AAAS fellows or glance at the New York Times obituary column. The easy way doesn't work that well. We also have to take a step back and think critically about the history of scientific professionalism and determine when the eminence granted by named professorships and prestigious prizes really does line up with long-term research value and when it doesn't. And that requires a little intentionality and some searching for figures who earned their own kind of eminence on their own terms. And so in closing, I will just let you know that we are a big public library and we're open for researchers. And please feel free to reach out to me or anyone at our Ask a Librarian site about collections that we have that you may be interested in speaking more about. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Q&A.
Josh, that is a wonderful, fascinating topic. And already like a few questions right in the chat. So let's start right with that. Are the Fitch papers available digitized on the internet at all?
No, they're not. Yeah, those have not been digitized. I have ready access to them, however, so I'm happy to make some scans and send those around.
Is there are you actively working to digitize some of these items to get them online?
Yeah, we do have a digitization program. We have quite a bit that is digitized. All of our presidential papers are digitized. All of our Civil War collections are digitized. A few science collections, like the Alexander Graham Bell papers, the Sigmund Freud papers, the Wright brothers papers, are digitized. But we just have so much material. We're a little unusual in that we count the items in our collections, and we estimate about 74 million items across everything. So the Fitch papers, I think, are unlikely to be digitized unless the entire Peter Force collection is also digitized. And that's a huge collection that actually is curated by one of my colleagues. So I'm not sure if she has plans to submit a digitization proposal for that one.
And here's a question that intersects the political questions with the archives and libraries from Marion Kahn. Is Library of Congress collecting the papers of scientists in science today, particularly those governmental programs that are being dismantled under the current administration?
That's a good question. Yeah. So our mission is a little different from the National Archives. The National Archives collects records of government organizations, including scientific agencies. We collect the papers of individuals. So there have been cases in the last year in which donors that I had been in touch with already for their papers have found that there was a major reorganization in their office, and we've been in touch with folks trying to get some materials that we can archive. But it is complicated. It's complicated in any time period and under any administration to try to figure out what kinds of papers you can collect from a government official, because likely if there's a government official that is well known enough and influential enough for you to want their papers, the National Archives considers them to have a what they call a capstone. Uh, I don't know what they say, capstone sort of set of records. So they tend to collect more stuff. So we have worked with some folks, but actively documenting the organizational records of an agency that's being dismantled is out of scope for us in general.
Okay. And here's a question from Mary Clark. Anything in the collection about the Fermi Lab and or the abortive efforts to build the superconducting super collider in Texas?
Good question. Not too much that's directly related, I don't think. We have some materials that are embedded within other collections that I think might speak a little bit to that, but no big obvious collection comes to mind.
Here's a question from Jim Goldman. Are prospective collections judged for acquisition by staff only, or are there panels of outside scientific peers? And if so, how are they formed?
Yeah, good question. So we do have an acquisitions committee, and that is me and the other historians within my office. The person that judges the research value of a science collection is me, really. I will sometimes consult with folks that have expertise that can help me kind of judge the value of things. We also take recommendations for potential collections, sometimes from existing donors. But yeah, I mean, as I mentioned a couple of times during the presentation, we of course respect the perspective of scientists, but scientists are not really big users of archives. I'm a historian of science, and historians of science tend to be an audience that's a lot more likely to access these collections. So it's some scientists that have interest in history for sure. There are people that have science backgrounds and science professorships that come in doing historical work. But I'd say that by far the bulk is people that are interested in kind of the broader social impact and the larger picture of how a scientist's work and projects fits in within the larger society. So the short answer is that there's no formal program to convene a panel of scientists to judge these collections, although we're certainly always happy to talk to everybody.
There's a couple questions from Mark Grossman, and in between, I'm going to ask a question. Are
Sure.
there plans to hold a future scientific manuscript conference?
Not exactly, but the paper that I just presented is a version of a draft article that me and some of my colleagues in other science collecting institutions have submitted to a journal. And we did that because it's the, what is it, the 60th, 75th? It's an anniversary of the Conference on Science Manuscripts as of last year. And so it's me and the American Philosophical Society and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and a few other institutions. So no conference, but we've been having a kind of informal conference amongst ourselves as we have put this group of papers together. So we are kind of consciously revisiting the conversations from the conference, but not in such a grand scale and not in the luxury of a place like the Cosmos Club.
And the papers that you listed that were from that conference, how would somebody access those to look at them?
There's two ways. One is that the entire conference was edited and published as a series of short papers in a special issue of ISIS in 1962. ISIS is the History of Science Society's journal. And so if you have access to JSTOR, the entire conference is on there. If you are very ambitious and interested, the Smithsonian Institution Archives has the records of the conference. But the records, there's a few places where it's interesting. What it is mostly is either the transcript of what was actually said, which has quite a bit of, you know, typos and things in it, and a bunch of sort of back and forth about who to invite to the conference, and a lot of discussion afterwards about whether they should continue the conversation and sort of formalize it into an advisory board, which they ultimately decide not to do. But the special issue of ISIS is plenty, but very interesting to read through.
A question from Brad Cook. He's the editor of Manuscripts magazine. Um, do you find items in your collection that were never accessioned? And if so, can you give us an example of one of your favorite unaccessioned discoveries?
Well, I mean, we accession entire collections at once. We do have unprocessed collections. I guess I could talk about one that we acquired a few years ago. Yeah, that I was just handling today. We have the papers of a electrician named George Maynard, who was the first agent for the Bell Company in Washington, D.C. And there's a little stack of handwritten estimates of his estimated work for building different telephone lines. And you can flip through this little stack of estimates and see like the first telephone connection to the Smithsonian and the first telephone connection to the Patent Office and the White House and the Treasury Building and that sort of thing. So we have unprocessed things that are here and there in what we call our small backlog. But for the most part, I don't think we have a lot of stuff that just sat around being unaccessioned for years and years. Hopefully not. I mean, hopefully we don't.
Yeah, yet to be discovered, right?
Yeah.
Another question from Mark Grossman. Does the Library of Congress hold any scientific medals that accompany the manuscripts?
Um, Our practice over the years has been that when a medal comes in, we have sent that to the Smithsonian. So I know of a number of collections where a scientist received a medal, and then we have documentation in our case files that that was either transferred to the Smithsonian or donated as a separate collection. We have a few things that are sort of medal-like. In the Anthony Fauci papers, he had a little coin that I guess was more like a challenge coin than a medal, but it was from that early period of the COVID pandemic when it was, what was the number, like 14 days to stop the spread or something like that. So that's a little relic of a brief moment in history. But in general, we don't collect a lot of scientific medals or medals from generals or other folks.
But that leads to a question that I have. Are there any special preservation concerns with these papers because they're scientific in nature about whether they're artifacts or
Um, I can't really think of special preservation concerns that wouldn't apply to other collections of ours. I mean, of course, there are collections that have preservation issues, but I don't think that's specific to them being related to science or technology.
a question from Bob Hopper. Do you work with the Edison Project and with the CSO Tech Archive?
I've been in touch with the Edison Project a little bit. I know they're looking for a new home for that work. We do have a little bit of Edison's papers, but not very much. I mean, we really don't have enough Edison material for us to be kind of seriously involved in a lot of Edison related projects. Alexander Graham Bell stuff, we're very involved.
And a question for myself: have you begun dealing with born digital materials from more of your current?
Yes,
Um,
yes. Yeah, we have. We have two digital archivists who kind of work with born digital material all the time. We've developed some procedures. I mean, I think like a lot of institutions, we're still figuring some things out. My role in born digital collecting is talking to donors and trying to determine what they have that they might be willing to donate to us. It's interesting. I mean, there's some of you that do similar work may have found the same thing. There's a big difference, I think, emotionally in asking somebody to donate a box of letters compared to a cache of emails, even though they sort of are the same thing. So the conversations that we have at the start are interesting. We now have tools that can scrape most things, including email accounts and cloud storage. We have legacy, media that can read old floppy disks and things like that. Of course, not everything comes through, but we can access most formats. And then in the last couple of years, we have started integrating our Born Digital files right into our finding aids. So you might see a finding aid that lists physical correspondence with a digital ID right after that. And researchers can take the digital ID and then bring it to our reference librarians. And then those files can be served in a special terminal in our reading room, just as though they were paper materials. And in some cases, when there's not copyright concerns, they can be served remotely. But we're doing okay with Born Digital stuff. We have not just set it to the side and then tried to figure it out later. But it is a struggle. I mean, it's very difficult to deal with those materials.
and what do you do with scientists who claim national eminence and they approach you about taking their papers? Do you find yourself saying no a lot and gently letting folks down
That
that
doesn't happen that often. You'd be
yeah, okay.
surprised, right? So, I mean, I think one thing that's really fascinating is for me, right? Like who thinks they're eminent and who doesn't. And there are some, I've said no a few times to folks. Sometimes it's not to the person. Sometimes it's to a family member who's convinced that, their father has passed away and they really want their legacy to be preserved in an institution they think is prestigious and like a lot of manuscript donations, that's part of a grieving process also. But in a broader sense, somebody that's like a politician or a general is a lot more likely to be convinced that they are significant, that they have an archive, and that that archive must be preserved for all time, compared to almost any scientist. As I mentioned briefly in the presentation, scientists tend to think that they have published everything that's important if there's nothing else. So why would anybody be interested in their correspondence and their drafts?
Yeah. And one final question from Mark Grossman. What about potential for radioactive contamination on physics manuscripts?
Good
Isn't Madame
question.
Curie's material still contaminated?
We do have one Marie Curie document. I don't know if she touched it. I think the thing that we have that's closest to being contaminated radioactively is a small piece of trinitite, which is a piece of irradiated melted glass from the Trinity test. Um, we have not tested any of those things. We don't have a Geiger counter. I have touched it a bunch of times. I hope it's safe. Other than that, I don't know of any items that we would suspect would be irradiated, but we do have the papers of a number of people that worked in the Manhattan Project and with radioactive material or atomic bombs. So there may be some sort of testing that's happened before my time that I don't know about, but I have never heard anybody mention the possibility of things being irradiated. So I don't know, fingers crossed. I hope that's a good enough
Yeah.
answer.
Well, it is now 9 o'clock. We've gone through the questions, quite a few questions answered. So thank you very much, Josh. And
Sure.
I think I agree with everybody that the presentation was fascinating, and I very much appreciate the work you're doing to preserve this material because, yeah, a lot of scientists they may not think they're worth their raw materials are worth saving, and so I'm glad you're doing that. So thank you very much, and if you are part of the program, stay tuned for information in a couple weeks about our Manuscript Monday. So thanks again, Josh, and I hope everybody has a great evening and everybody be careful out there.
Thanks so much, Jay. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming and thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome.